Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to, I think, the 6th or 7th lecture in our lecture series of Reiss, the Research Center on the Transformation of Violence here in Marburg, organized by the Center for Conflict Studies. Today, I'm really happy to introduce to you Gabi Schlag, who is a senior lecturer at University of Tübingen. And Gabi is really one of the, I would say one of the few, but certainly one of the most well-known and most proficient and prolific writers about what has been sometimes called visual turn in world politics. And that is also the content of most of her publications, Visuality and International Relations and World Politics. I have to say, maybe one personal note, when I started my PhD, your writing was one of the first things that I discovered, and I thought, okay, I need to change my topic entirely because this was this was so interesting. In the end, I didn't.
Good song.
But then this kind of kept working in my head. I should kind of engage with this more, and I kept reading what you're doing. So it's really nice to have you here. And I think a presentation with PowerPoint is actually the right format for engaging with visuality, much more than other topics, probably. So I'm really looking forward. We will, as every week, hear your lecture, and then we will have time for an open discussion. So feel free to ask Gabi any questions. And yeah, we're really happy to have you here. And I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felix, and also Mariel for the invitation to this lecture. I feel a little bit, very honored that I'm here and a little bit old because you said that you were a young PhD student and I was already in Frankfurt when you joined the university there. So, yes, let me start with this lecture and presentation. So I have to apologize. It is a rather formal talk, given the topic is a little bit more conceptual and theoretical than probably most of the talks I'm giving at other occasions. And also I haven't given this talk before. So it's really something new, probably based, of course, on my work and research in the last years, but hopefully a new turn and also something for you to think about later and to discuss, of course. Now it doesn't work to move.
Yeah, now it works.
Now it works. Okay, so as I said, thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. The title of this lecture series, Perspectives on Violence in the 21st Century, I think already mentions the visual. Art history, for example, understands perspective as the ability of representing three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. By perspective, however, we also mean a way of regarding something while acknowledging that there is not one, but certainly many points of view. When graphic images of atrocities and violence are displayed, our point of view is often highly emotional. We literally say it hurts to look at this picture. And in my talk today, I want to unpack the meaning of these words by looking at violence and its visual representations. In a nutshell, my main argument is that an image of violence is not only defined by its motive, showing a violent action or its visible outcome, but also by the representational practices of its making, presence, and use. And based on this argument, I will develop a typology which outlines 5 different figurations of violence and its visual representations. As the topic of this talk today is violence, I also want to say a few words about ethics at the very beginning. When the subject of a picture is suffering, many people are concerned. What does it mean to look at photographs of violence and suffering? Is there a right way to look at any of this? Susie Linfield, for example, asked. Perhaps not. So let me illustrate this with an example. In 1993, South African photojournalist Kevin Carter was sent to Sudan to report on the famine. There is one iconic photo which shows a collapsed, starving boy with a vulture in the background eyeing at the child. This picture won the Pulitzer Prize in the following year. I will not show this image, and I cannot really explain rationally why I'm not able to show it. It deeply moves me. So whenever I see this picture, it hurts me, like I said in the beginning. So after the photograph appeared in the New York Times, many readers wrote to the editors. Some blamed, for example, the photographer for his neglect of help. Some accused the newspaper to make profit out of poverty pornography. Some asked just about the fate of the child. Carter, the photographer, died of suicide 1 year later, and many assumed that he was haunted by the memories of suffering, the things he had seen during his deployment in Sudan. So those in favor of displaying this image argue that it bears witness to horrors that cannot be understood by words alone. It shows the effects of direct violence and probably of injustice as well. Therefore, the image functions as a constant reminder and warning. Those, however, who criticize the publication of this picture say that it disrespects the dignity of the victim, reiterates a highly inaccurate image of the global South as being underdeveloped and helpless, neglects also the responsibility of the global North for this suffering, and may finally promote compassion fatigue instead of solidarity. So given this example of Carter's iconic image, how photographs are used and what context is chosen in which to deploy them is vitally important, as David Campbell argues. So this example also illustrates that just showing a photograph is often assumed to be powerful, making a difference, whatever that difference then is or may be. Nowadays, we often see images of violence on the internet with a warning like this one. Editors and publishers restrict the display of graphic images formally through guidelines, for example, and informally also through economies of good taste. Critics, however, frequently show that media representations are highly gendered and often racialized, creating a hierarchy of whose violence and pain is made visible or remains unseen. While it is, of course, true to say that the absence of graphic images from the public has not diminished violence itself, the effects of their presence are highly uncertain. A warning sign should, of course, not be an easy excuse to look away from images that are disgusting. And I will also later show some images where you might feel troubled to look at them. In my selection, of course, of images for this presentation, I tried to find an adequate balance of what I'm actually showing here and what not. And I also took into account that this lecture is recorded. And also I assume that permission to show the pictures is given due to the academic freedom and of course the non-profit aim of this lecture here. So given these introductory words, I'm addressing 5 questions in my talk. What does violence mean? What is an image that matters? How is violence visually represented? How do powerful visual discourses and practices regulate violence in the global constellation? And finally, what are the political implications if violence needs its representation, if images originate violent or are even perceived as violent? Violence, and I guess you have heard about this in the last lectures already a lot, is quite an elusive concept. So scholars distinguish different levels of violence, like the micro and the macro level, as well as different types of violence, like direct violence, structural, cultural, symbolic, epistemic, gendered, political, slow violence, and so on. One can also, of course, zoom in on different spaces of violence, the local, national, regional, and global. Violence can be a public spectacle or unfold in private. One might witness a violent action directly or just be entertained by how it is performed in a movie. Violence manifests in time, slow or fast, for example, as Rob Nixon argues, and has been and certainly will be a constant feature of societies. Violence is often seen as an inherently agentic practice. We talk about perpetrators who exercise violence, victims who experience it, and third parties who might indirectly assist, watch, or permit violent action. Acting out requires not only motivation, some argue, but also knowledge and competence. One must know how to violate, to harm, to injure a body, or know how to resist the pain. The situated knowledge may be informed by literature, paintings, or other cultural artifacts narrating and depicting how to use violence. So let me give you a prominent example. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, CIA interrogators watched the classic The Battle of Algiers. That's a movie from 1966 about French counterterrorism tactics in Algeria, to introduce techniques for special interrogation, which is, of course, an euphemism for torture. Torture scenes are a common feature in movies and in many TV shows, also in those that have no political background or no political storyline. However, these scenes are often driving the story and intend to satisfy the desire of the spectator for the exceptional, as some scholars like Darius Rejali or Randall Collins argue. They are often not a documentary account of torture or excessive violence. Finally, the causes and consequences of violence have attracted a lot of academic and public attention, investigating the potential anthropological, social, political, and economic drivers of violent action, as well as the structural, behavioral, embodied, discursive, instrumental, symbolic, and expressive side of its manifestation. The ordering and disordering effects of violence related to questions of power and authority, when, for example, capitalism, colonialism, or the patriarchy are described as orders of violence and injustice. Therefore, many scholars emphasize that violence semantically overlaps with other elusive concepts like force, power, or aggression. War, criminal offenses, and killings are often used as a synonym for violence. According to one scholar, to Heinrich Popitz, violence is an act of power, leading to intentional physical injury of another, either to demonstrate power or to subjugate. Thus, violence is both a competence as well as an action. Everyone can become an agent of violent behavior and an end of it. Violence is always an option, and structures, of course, contribute to its persistence as well as to its prohibition. We encounter violence everywhere, but not, of course, everyone is subjected to it in the same ways. Normatively, violence is often seen as highly ambivalent or even problematic, I think. By injuring a body, the dignity and unique identity of a person, the identity of a person is violated or even destroyed. And paradoxically, we also say that violence can be authorized by the state or other actors to stop violations, and the use of violence may also be a mean to subject constitution, as for example, Frantz Fanon argues in the case of Algerian resistance to French colonial power. So let me briefly summarize what I at least take away from this rather general discussion about violence. First, violence hurts, harms, injures, and destroys, and of course, in a literal and in a metaphorical sense. It's a social, relational, and situated practice devaluating life and exalting power. As a meaningful practice, it is shaping and shaped by structures that enable and constrain its exercise, prevalence, and transformation. To violate implies to cross a red line, a sacred boundary, a boundary, of course, that is constantly rewritten by these acts of violence and how they are socially, politically, and legally assessed. Second, non-direct, non-agentic violence is often invisible, and it's much more difficult to detect as debates, for example, around slow violence or epistemic violence illustrate. Invisibility, however, reveals the power of scopic regimes. The I quote Pierre Bourdieu, is a product of history reproduced by education. And I would also add, of course, not only by education, but by other powerful institutions like culture and media. The simple truth, I think, is that we are not very used to see, to listen, to feel, to acknowledge an unspectacular type of everyday violence. Third, what counts as violence, of course, is historically and culturally contingent. It is shaped by the social, political, economic, and legal context of its time. By labeling behavior or structural condition as violent, actors often intend to problematize it. For example, rape has not always been a criminal offense, in particular in marriage. It was only in 1997 that the German legislator revised the criminal law to prosecute such offenses. And we should also keep in mind that violence is not always perceived as unjust, right? So resistance to oppression, to police brutality, to state brutality is often seen as a legitimate act, or in some instances, even a legal act of resistance and the use of violence. And finally, physical violence regularly, of course, intersects with other forms of violence, in particular, what is nowadays identified as symbolic, structural, and epistemic, to justify the subordination and destruction of bodies. Knowledge and sensibility are important means to shape orders of visibility. Who has the right to look and to be looked at, how and when? And this right to look, I think, is of course inevitably linked to scopic regimes, imaginaries, and images. So when people think about images, they often refer to iconic pictures, images that made history somehow. So when you Google the term, a long list of photographs appears. For example, Robert Capar's image of a falling soldier during the Spanish Civil War in 1936, Eddie Adams' still of an execution in Saigon in 1968, and the photo of an unknown protester in Beijing. Oh, okay, I think the connection. So maybe I show you all of them, right? Beijing, here, there is this picture, right? So a photo of an unknown protester in Beijing from June 1989. And of course, while photojournalists regularly dominate this best of lists, iconic images are not limited to photography. And that's why I included, for example, also a picture of Van Gogh's oil painting of sunflowers, a graffiti by Banksy on a destructed house wall in Ukraine, or even the world map turned red as iconic as an icon for climate change and how we can make it visible. So what makes an image an icon? For Robert Harriman and John Lucitis, these images do not need a caption because they are an essential side and part of our visual culture and memory, as this long quote here shows. They are easily recognized, create emotional responses, they are widely reproduced, function often as a shortcut for a quite complex historical event, and frequently exceed what we can express by words. However, these secular icons are not by definition universal, but reflecting already dominant scopic regimes and global power constellations. An image, I think, is always made for someone and for something. So let me explain this a little bit in detail. Most iconic images are not, of course, natural, but somehow created, somehow made by someone. And while humans, for example, painters, photographers, designers, have been key producers of images throughout history, throughout different cultures, authorship is, of course, not limited to them. Artificial intelligence, as well as other species like Naruto's selfie, you can see here, or Renaissance paintings created by the image generator DALL-E illustrate. There is a keyboard and a desktop, right, in this painting as well. So these images, these pictures are not made by humans, right? And if we agree that an icon is made, of course, then practices are key to it. The internet has enhanced the speed and scope for sharing images that may become iconic, sometimes only for a short moment or a small community. Remember, more than 3.2 billion images are shared every day online. And these numbers are from 2020. So you can assume they are even higher today. On Instagram, for example, the most liked picture is a photo of an egg with almost 56 million votes. Artist Beyoncé's portrait as Madonna with twins in July 2017, or the tweet by Korean boy group member Jungkook in 2021 got over 3 million likes in less than 3 hours. Even politicians are using images to communicate. For example, when President Zelensky shared a video on the 25th of February, proving that his fellow officials and he himself are still in Kiev. So the Latin and ancient Greek word icon is traditionally applied to images, symbols, and pictures in the context of religious devotion. In general, icon implies a kind of identity and difference between what is or has been, how it is shown, and thereby made present. We all, of course, know that a photo of a loved one is not him, his body, his mind. However, we take care of this picture as if, right? As if it is symbolizing part of our intimate relation. And we might only scratch out his eyes or tear apart the photo when the love ended, also to symbolically harm him. For W.J.T. Mitchell, image is a word with many connotations. And I think this is probably different depending on the language, whether we talk about this in German, in English, in French, and so on. So it means for him, any likeness, figure, motive, or form that appears in some medium or other. We use it for graphic images like pictures, optical images like projections, perceptual images like, for example, data graphs, mental images like dreams, or verbal images like metaphors. All these notions share that we assume both a close assembly connection between the image and what it is representing, and of course, a division. We know that the image is not that what it is showing, right? So, and this dualism of assembly and division is, of course, politically consequential, because it inevitably difference between the represented and its representation is the very location of politics, as Roland Pleiker argues. Discursive practices bridge this gap between the represented and its representation by disciplining, normalizing, naturalizing a specific meaning, while meaning, of course, in general remains fluid, contested, and changeable. And here you can, of course, easily see how a Foucauldian post-structuralist conception of power, knowledge, and discourse informs my argumentation, and I think a lot of other work that is associated with visual IR, visual global politics as well. So, as this quote from David Campbell summarizes, discourses are about the production of meanings, identities, and relations. Powerful discourses discipline in order to produce a certain political subject and to justify a certain action. Focusing on discourses, though, does not, of course, neglect the material realities of violence. Campbell, again, I think provides a good example that also fits to the topic of this lecture series. A bullet in the head is not discursive, but material. It ends a life, right? And of course, a post-structuralist does not deny the materiality of the bullet or the reality of death caused by the bullet. However, the dead body and the bullet does tell us nothing about the meaning and the significance of these elements. Discourses shape whether the dead body and the bullet in her head is understood as suicide, murder, ethnic cleansing, genocide, or something else. They bridge the gap between the represented and its representation. And the images made and used to prove or even to contest the death and its meaning are an essential part of these discursive practices to know violence and its consequences. So, like the use of language, images might form something like discursive nodal points and produce visual chronicles. An image is characterized by its sensual immediacy, self-referentiality, polysemic meaning, and performativity. And of course, some of this overlaps with how we think about words and language, but some also shows that there is a difference whether we are using words or just using images to convey meaning. So visual representations are sensible, durable, and to a certain degree, of course, also material as they appear through a medium. A medium brings together technologies of production, distribution, and reception. And finally, conventions function like a grammar as they guide the intelligibility and interpretation of visual meanings. Journalistic photography usually applies different rules, norms, and styles than, for example, art photography. And audiences, of course, require some kind of competences and skills to read or to decode the meanings of an image. So let me summarize the key points about images. Visual representations are essential for discourses, I think, in two ways. First, they are communicative and performative acts, saying, look at this and see. As Roland Pleiker writes, images influence the distribution of the sensible and more general shape conditions of the possible. what we can see, sense, know, and of course act upon. And second, they are entangled with practices understood as situated and relational doings. Visualities are one practice among many, and in their routinization and place specificity, they make certain sorts of things visible in particular ways, as Gillian Rose writes. So let me now return to my main claim from the beginning of the talk. I argue that an image of violence is not only defined by its motive, showing a violent action or its visible outcome, but by the representational practices of its making, presence, and use. And in the following part of my presentation, I will now introduce a kind of typology, maybe heuristic, not sure how to call it, right? With 5 different figurations that conceptualize how visual representations and violence relate. Right, so, and that's the documentary image of violence, the cultural image of violence, images that are provoking violence, iconoclastic violence, and finally, what I call violent images. So, images that are documenting violent behavior, I think, are omnipresent. As violent conflicts around the world last, so do their visual representations, of course. They commonly freeze an instance of violence, either zooming in on the act of violence itself, or more frequently, its destructive force. War photography, for example, defines a journalistic type of its own, representing fighters and victims or documenting destruction. However, we all know that not all wars are visually represented, and of course not visually represented in equal ways. Not all violence is captured by a camera's eye, and even when violent conflicts are captured by a camera's eye, the images are highly selective and subjective. It is said that the first photographs of war were made in 1847, depicting scenes from the Mexican-American War in Saltillo. Some years later, 4 British photographers officially documented the Crimean War beginning in 1853. Roger Fenton, for example, is an early war photographer. One of his best-known pictures is this one here, The Valley of the Shadow of Death. However, it was also staged to some extent, as Fenton moved cannonballs into the road to aesthetically highlight the massive destruction, although we don't see a human being here in this photo. While early war photography was characterized by the absence of direct physical violence and death, the most iconic images are exactly showing these horrors of war, for example, as Nick Utz's picture of the girl Kim Phuc. War photography may expose conditions and practices of injury with the aim to move the audience to action. These pictures are often stay with us, haunt us, are widely memorized, and have somehow become secular icons, in particular, the image of Kim Phuc. These visual representations focalize violence to physical existential harm that is done to someone, frequently a child or woman. Photographs are commonly adjusted to the publication context, of course, as we can see here. That's the actual report in the New York Times using the picture of Nick Ut, but in a quite smaller frame than the original one. So while Nick Ut's picture is documenting violence in action, many other photographs depict the effects of violence, death and destruction. And it's also necessary to mention that images with a documentary ethos are not limited, of course, to photography. Before photography was invented, of course, we also had images of violent conflicts. So, for example, between 1810 and 1820, Francisco Goya, a famous painter, created 82 prints and gave the series the title, The Disasters of War. Many popular visual representations are, of course, not documentary in nature, but cultural and aesthetic, like Goya's prints. By cultural, I mean that they are somehow composed, designed, and acted by applying aesthetic techniques, types, and styles. While a violent event or conflict will still occur without a photograph documenting it, cultural images of violence are authored, enacted, and directed. So it's, for example, violence that attracts attention when a naked James Bond, performed by Daniel Craig, is tortured in the movie Casino Royale, or, for example, here in another documentary about the Khmer Rouge, where actual perpetrators reenact the violence and the techniques they used to kill people in the documentary by Oppenheimer. Right? And also video games often have a strong component part of where you have to use violence, you have to kill someone to come to the next level, right? To play the game to its end. Popular culture, however, also illustrates that the visual representations of violence may have rather ambivalent effects. If you are playing Call of Duty, of course, this does not imply that you tend to violent behavior or that you're legitimate violent. It may be just a game. Artists frequently engage with the aesthetic possibilities and limits of representing violence. At the Biennale 1997 in Venice, performance artist Marina Abramovic washed and scrubbed cow bones and sang folk songs. With her performance, she metaphorically referred to the war in Bosnia, explaining in an interview, "You can't wash the blood from your hands as you can't wash the shame from the war." Other examples are for Gerhard Richter's blurred paintings based on press pictures. Here, one iconic image from 9/11, or Picasso's painting Guernica, made in 1937. The government of the Spanish Republic commissioned Picasso to create a large mural for the Spanish pavilion in the Paris World Fair. The aim of the painting was to make people aware of the war and to raise money. The public reaction to the oil painting, however, was a little bit mixed. It toured European countries and the US and remained at the Museum of Modern Art in New York until 1981, and nowadays it's in Spain. Guernica became a symbol, for example, of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And there is also an interesting story about the relation of the represented and its representation here. Asked by the Gestapo, "Did you do this?" Picasso replied, "No, you did." Popular media like film, however, may also contribute to the justification of violence. During the Third Reich, artists, filmmakers, and writers popularized anti-Semitic imaginaries and fascist aesthetics. The film Jud Süß, directed by Veit Harlan, premiered at the Venice Film Festival in 1940 and won a prestigious award. It was seen by approximately 20 million people back then. The film screening is nowadays publicly banned in Germany since 1945, and Harlan, the director, was the only film director of the Third Reich to be charged with crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. However, he was not convicted, but only the film was prohibited from being shown publicly. So time and again, images also provoke violent reactions. Prominent example are the Mohammed cartoon crisis in Denmark in 2005, or the deadly attack on the editorial office of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in 2015. Activists and critics sometimes respond to the exhibition of art with demands to remove the work. Also, this is, I think, an example here. So in 2017, Dana Schutz presented a painting at the Whitney Biennale. The motive here is referring to a picture of Emmett Till in an open casket. The 14-year-old boy was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955. The photo of the open casket became an icon of the civil rights movement in the United States. But Schutz, the white-colored artist of the painting, was now accused to transmute black suffering into profit. And also the sculpture of a Mac Jesus provoked violent protests in Israel in January 2019. And finally, when US President Obama decided not to release a visual proof of Osama bin Laden's dead body, he said that such a photo could incite violence and be used by militants as a propaganda tool. And I think he fully understood what the power of images means to move and to mobilize people. Iconoclasm refers to the belief that icons, idols, and symbols must be destructed to purify a society. The term originates from the Byzantine Empire when the authorities of the Orthodox Church exposed the use of religious images. Iconoclastic movements are not purely aesthetic, but of course have always been somehow religious and or political, expressing societal power struggles. Iconoclasm, though, is not an ancient practice, but continues nowadays in different ways. In March 2014, the Canadian suffragette Mary Richardson attacked the oil painting of a naked woman made by Velázquez with a meat chopper at the National Gallery in London. She was protesting against the arrest of Emily Pankhurst, a key figure of the women's movement. Richardson, of course, chose the painting not only because it's expensive and well known, but she said because the way man visitors gaped at it all day long. The Taliban destroyed monumental Buddha statues in 2001, and ISIS smashed sculptures in Palmyra and in other locations in 2015. So then UNESCO General Secretary Irina Bokova said that ISIS is guilty of cultural cleansing and that the destruction of heritage constitutes a war crime. And more recently, activists around the world are attacking or even taking down monuments of colonial rulers in South Africa, UK, Belgium, or the United States, or they attack the monuments. And finally, of course, climate activists of the last generation threw smashed potato at a painting by Monet and other artists and taped their hands to the gallery walls. And while here the artwork was not really damaged, media attention was high and public responses, I think we can say, fairly controversial. And finally, now I want to talk about violence that is co-producing images and vice versa. In absence of a better term, I call these violent images and imaginaries. I think maybe a German translation might be gewaltförmige Bilder und Bildwelten. In Excitable Speech, Politics of the Performative, first published in 1997, Judith Butler asked, when we claim to have been injured by language, what kind of claim do we make? What kind of claim do I make when I say that a picture hurts, harms, and injures? Some images, either photographic or not, possess the capacity to induce suffering, pain, harm, and injury symbolically and physically. In these cases, the performance of violence is essentially entangled with the act of representing it visually, I argue. Claiming that an image may be violent often provokes strong criticism. I have made this point before. By stating this, I would essentialize, decontextualize, and glorify the image as an agent, critics said. So, and maybe they are right. We can discuss about this later. However, I think of some examples which show that the relation between violence and its representation, or representation and its violence, is highly ambivalent. Historically, culturally, politically, of course, the examples I will show differ. And I do not claim that they are similar or part of the same general story. Again, is there a right way to look at any of these images? I assume there is not a right way to look at this, but a need to understand the performativity of violent images. Lynching Black people has been a horrific public spectacle in some US states until the late 1950s. Some argue it even continues today when we look at police brutality, for example, and the forced death of George Floyd and many others. Back in the first 2 decades of 1900, one could buy postcards with photographs showing lynched men and women, and frequently the white mob applauding, like this one. Should we regard these postcards as an essential part of lynching practices in general, maybe as a trophy, as a fetish, as a symbol of power, literally saying, look what we can do publicly? The act of lynching and its visual representation is a competence and an action related to the power of the white people over Black bodies. The continuous display of these documentary images reminds us how decisive the social context is. Who is using these pictures, how and with what intentions? We can easily see that it makes a huge difference whether activists of Black Lives Matter show a lynching photograph at a public protest to prove racial violence and its history, or alt-right members share these images as trophies on Reddit or 8chan or any other platform. Another example is the iconic image of the hooded man from Abu Ghraib. While there had been a controversy who is truly depicted, there are no doubts that even Frederick II, private of the US military police in Iraq, shot photos. For the abuse and torture of prisoners, he was sentenced to 8 years confinement, loss of rank and pay, and received a dishonorable discharge in 2004. In media outlets, a selective frame is often used, like this one from the edition of The Economist. Frederick's colleague, Sabrina Harmon, though, documented the scenery shown in this image. Here again, I assume that Harmon's framing of the scene illustrates the deep entanglement of the act of violence and its photographic representation by showing that Frederick is either checking the quality of pictures on his small camera display or getting started to make photos. Susan Sontag wrote in the New York Times, I quote, "The horror of what is shown in the photographs cannot be separated from the horror that the photographs were taken with the perpetrators posing, gloating over their helpless captives." Given these two examples, a word of clarification and caution might be necessary. I'm not claiming that violent action presupposes the capacity to visually record it. The infliction of pain and the continuity of structural violence frequently takes place without a camera capturing it. However, I argue that the practices of representation are an essential part of the social relational constellation that is permitting violence here. And I will outline two more examples to show this entanglement of representations and violence. The beheading videos of the jihadist group ISIS have, of course, attracted a lot of attention for many reasons. A key aspect is the technically mundane recording of an immediate performance. Equipped with a lot of visual symbolism, for example, the orange suit and the stagey plot, the video shows the beheading here of journalist James Foley in real. Beheading Foley is a physically brutal act of violence to end his life, and this act of violence is recorded. During the post-violence and production stage, the material is then cut and edited to fix it for global distribution and reception. And interesting, though, is that the moment of his death, the act and action itself is deleted, or at least not included in the final video that was distributed, leaving a void which, on the one hand, gives room for our imagination, how this could look like, but also, of course, secures that media outlets are showing this video. The video's visual representation aims at affecting horror and fear at the side of the audience by re-witnessing the act of violence. Again, the presence of the camera and the reciting images in a literal and metaphorical sense are an integral part of the violent action itself. People are killed to become icons, as Horst Bredekamp noted in 2009. Due to digital technologies, broadcasting acts of violence live and in real time describes a new reality. There are several stories, but my last example is Brenton Tarrant's orchestration of his mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand in March 2019. He killed 51 and injured 40 people within 20 minutes. 4,000 people watched the video of his deed live on Facebook. No user flagged the content as inappropriate or notified authorities. It took about 29 minutes for Facebook to stop the broadcast. Meanwhile, users had already copied the video or taken screenshots and uploaded them to Facebook, YouTube, and other social media platforms again. Facebook removed 1.5 million copies of the video in the first 24 hours after the attack. The entanglement of the act and its video illustrate again that both sides are mutually constitutive. The enactment of the killing is designed for its live streaming, using popular video game perspectives, YouTuber aesthetics, and narratives of reality shows. As Kevin Rose aptly puts it, I quote, "A surprising thing about the video is how unmistakably online the violence was." So, if we take the different forms of violence seriously, making images becomes an essential part of it. Then practices of representation direct our attention to the making of images as embedded in structurally, epistemically violent constellations. And due to digital communication infrastructures, these images have a global scope. How someone is using the camera, the brush, or InDesign reflects the power of, over, and to representation. So let me conclude. I have talked a lot. So let me conclude. The variety of images I used for this presentation reminds us of different points of view or perspectives on agents, structures, spaces, and times of violence. Maybe some of you are now thinking, what has all of this to do with politics and international relations? So at least that's my academic background. I'm trained as a political scientist, specialized in IR. So political science in general and international relations in particular are not very prominent disciplines when it comes to studying images and scopic regimes. Well, this has changed in the last 2 decades as the work of, I cited, David Campbell, Roland Pleiker, Lena Hansen, Bill Callahan, has changed. Our theoretical understanding of violence and its visual representation is still incomplete. I think that this is surprising due to a very simple observation. Much of our knowledge of violent conflicts here and around the world in the past and today is informed by the images we see and the stories we hear. It's all about representations. A post-structuralist understands images as effects of power. They define what can be seen and what remains unseen. Representations, either visual or verbal, shape the conditions of possibility and sensibility for political action. Or as Mieke Baal asked, what happens when people look and what emerges from that act? I want to close with 3 preliminary answers to this question. What emerges from this act of showing and seeing? First, visual politics directs our attention to the discourses and practices that are producing subjects, subjectivities, and relations. For example, who is a victim of violence? Who is a perpetrator? How do they socially relate? Second, visual representations mobilize emotions and affects. I heard you had a workshop, I guess, about this today. And I think this is especially true for images of suffering, pain, and death. The effects of showing and seeing such images are often ambivalent, uncertain, and oblique. We cannot say for sure that a picture of horrific violence will make history or change politics. Third, the political decisions require justification, maybe less in the context of authoritarian rule, but definitely for democracies. So politics are shaped by what is represented as vital, appropriate, and legitimate, and images contributed by being made, presented, and used. And therefore, I think we should care about visual representations because they matter and because their meaning and use is often contested. Images make world politics, as Lena Hansen writes, for the better and of course, the worse. Thank you very much for your attention. And that's it. Very much looking forward to the discussion.
Just gonna close this. Yeah, thank you very, very much. It was indeed the perfect continuation of our workshop today. We watched the movie Concerning Violence, and we had a lot of images and discussions about what we want to represent and what kind of representation, visually speaking, creates what kinds of responses. So I think there will be an interesting discussion to have. I don't want to forestall any of that. So I'm just opening the floor for questions. If you have any, make yourself known by raising your hand towards Joschka with a mic or myself. Is there a first question in the room? That side. Just as a reminder, the microphone is for the people online. So please speak into the mic, even though it doesn't amplify your voice in the room. It's a bit confusing, but still do it so everybody can be part of this.
Thank you very much. At first, it was very interesting. My question is, you just briefly said that images of violence taken from photojournalists were mostly of landscapes and people were missing. I'm curious when that changed.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. Very good point. There is a lot of research on the history of photography and in particular war photography. I think that's the most prominent style and type of photography with a political relevance. So if I get it right, so in the beginning, late 19th century, early 19th century, you have more or less heroic images from war and violent conflicts, and more these images showing the army, showing maybe the battlefield. And I think at least with the First World War, this dramatically changes. And many experts on the topic say, of course, this has also to do with the mobility of the camera, right? You need to take a camera to the battlefield to report from the front. So there are many photojournalists who embrace Leica. I'm not advertising Leica here, but with the development of these light cameras, I think the visual representation of violent conflicts changed. And of course, this has not only to do with technology, but also with how news developed, how they were able to include photographs for the reports on conflicts. And I think it also has to do with the changing normative order, right? To embrace human rights, to be more concerned about the loss of life and also the loss of a soldier's life. So many say that it's then, of course, the peak is the Vietnam War. Some describe it as the first TB war being shown on TV, or with reports on TV, at least in the United States, having an impact also on the anti-Vietnam War movement and the mobilization of people. And then I think and of course, there's much more to the story, but just to maybe to highlight some periods. Then, of course, we have this idea of embedded journalism coming up in the 1990s, and then, of course, in the early 2000s, where journalists became part of the battle, the platoon, right? And of course, this, I think, also again changed a little bit how human-centered the visual reporting is, or how much it is rather on the material destructive side. But I think we can see this throughout the history of war photography, to having changes in the focus on whether it's on the soldiers, on the destruction, on the enemy, on the support of the troops, on the critical reporting of war crimes, right? So I think we can see different periods. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I thought that your typology was very interesting. And my question is, how does that relate to images that are deceptively manipulated, be that to seemingly prove something that didn't happen, right? Be that through staging an event that maybe isn't what it's seemingly saying, or through post-production and maybe digitally or physically manipulating the image that you took.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question too. I think there's concern about the authenticity of images has always been an important part of discussions. So sometimes we tend to associate manipulation with digital imaginary, which of course is not true. That's why I showed this Fenton photography, where he at least manipulated the scenery that he was taking a picture. So of course, I think most scholars agree images are not about the truth, right? But of course, images, there might be some images that are more authentic than others, whatever then authenticity means, right? Yeah, and my personal view on this is, of course, I think there is now, with the digital possibilities, we have to not only to manipulate an image, but to create an image that is fake, like these deep fake things. That might be something different, right? So that we are technically able to create a photographic image which is made up, which is not real, but looks like real. And of course, there's a lot of research on manipulation, manipulating audience, perception, public opinion by using this image instead of another, or also by framing images and showing just a selective part of a picture. This Kim Fook photograph, there was a lot of discussion about the framing of the New York Times, where they only used the small frame, putting the naked girl in the center, instead of showing that there have been soldiers, US soldiers around trying to help her. Also, they were accused of, there's a long story to this picture. Maybe you can look this up. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. I was wondering, in light of the conceptualization that you presented and your research, how did you go about making the decisions of including images for the presentation? So the sort of remediation through this presentation, what to include. You said already that you decided to leave some images out, but also aesthetic choices that you made. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really difficult question. Not sure. I think, at least for me, I feel I'm personally attracted by some images, but not by others. I'm not sure whether you can explain why you like this picture, but not another one. I think there might be some general, aesthetic qualities that play into my decisions to use pictures or not to use pictures. I also tried, of course, to have most prominent, most popular images that hopefully you as an audience can easily catch up with this. However, this sometimes turns in another direction. And so one of my minors was art history. So you can see that's probably the reason why I have a love for, also this artistic, aesthetic side of images, including paintings and performance artists. And so, but of course, you as an audience, each of you might have, other preferences and other experience. But I think it's important to keep this in mind, that the selection of images is always also a personal choice, expressing personal preferences, experience, you know. I hope I did not offend anyone with pictures. So I did this in a seminar years ago. And yeah, since then I'm quite, you know, I try to be quite reflective and cautious and conscious about what I can show, but also without denying, of course, that violence is going on, right? If we always look away, maybe this might also be a politically and ethically, yeah, flawed, problematic choice.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the presentation as well from me. I just had to think of something because I've recently read an article on the desensitization of people when they are frequently exposed to hate speech. And I was just wondering if maybe you've also seen something in this area where obviously with social media and the way now our news system works, we're like frequently exposed to a lot of images of violence, obviously, and whether you think that that could possibly or has led to some sort of desensitization in society, and whether that might also translate to some sort of race for the best picture, I guess. Best picture man doesn't, you know, the most terrible one, I guess. Yeah, that would be my question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good point. I think social media and the quantity of images that can be shared by everyone, right, without, you know, editorship and a selection committee, this is changing something. However, I'm not sure what is changing, you know, what are the effects. So I think if you go back in history, maybe, for example, 1950s and 60s, there is a lot of discussion about pornography and what is acceptable in public and how can minors be saved, right? So, and there also you have quite graphic images, right, which were shown, and then so I'm not sure whether today we see images that are more or showing more violence than before. But of course, this depends very much to the audience, to your experience. I think also a lot of newsmakers, editors, journalists are quite conscious about violence and how they present it. Even if we go to yellow press editors, right? So they think a lot about what they show and not. And of course, making a newspaper is about selling the newspaper. Without selling the newspaper, you will not have journalists you can hire to report. So I think it's a good point, but I'm unsure whether it's a really new thing and what are the effects of graphic images shown online. But the other point you made, I think there is, maybe that's how I came to this idea of violent images. We talk a lot about hate speech, but we don't talk a lot about hate images. Is there something like a hate image, right? Or is this ridiculous to argue that images are somehow similar to enduring with or harming with a word?
I was wondering what I was thinking about the football World Cup and you know, about the German national team, you know, like covering their mouth, and German politicians using the one love flag, and how that resulted in, as I see it, quite the contrary from what they expected. So people saying that's hypocritic. While on the other hand side, you saw a lot of Arab countries and their representatives wearing the Palestine flag, which, as I saw, resulted in, you know, a lot of people from, for example, Jordan saying, now you see the hypocrisy of the West, and we stand behind that picture of our leaders. So my question is kind of what determines the success of an image regarding its effective power?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. If I had an answer, I would not stand here, but earn a lot of money or be a professor at a very prestigious university. I think that's the €1 million yen question that many scholars in communication media studies are interested in, to have more empirical data about the features of an image or in symbolic action, like what you told about to see whether to predict somehow that this picture will make a difference, and not only a difference, but a difference exactly in the direction where maybe the producer or the presenter wants to go. I think I'm not sure. Of course, there are some typical motives that are preferred, like children and women are more presented, individuals presenting an individual face with a news story has a different effect than just an abstract image or a group, like what you have read about during the so-called migration crisis, right? But I think the important point is here, it makes a difference. And also that the meanings of these symbolic acts and also the images and pictures that are shown can be quite contested, right? Depending on the audience, depending maybe on the ability to contextualize it and connect it to different discourses.
I also have a question. You talked about the globalization also of images and the global reception. But last year I did an excursion with students from Cambodia, and I was quite surprised how little globalization of perception there is. So to give you an example, we went to Berlin, and we went to the memorial for the murdered Jews of the Holocaust, and we also went to the former concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. And they said that both of these memorials were very bad because they were not graphic enough. They were too abstract. And then we talked a lot about like sensitizing of images, and what you just referred to, the intention not to re-traumatize or traumatize visitors. And their reaction was, how should we learn from history when we don't get traumatized? And I was just struck. I mean, I cannot deny the logic. It's just a very different logic. I was struck at how different the perception was. So my question would be, is there like systematic study into perception, how it travels? What kind of determines different, I don't want to say cultural, but like perceptions over time and space? Are you aware of that? And is there any like research going on into that?
Yeah, very good point. And I think what you said, and also the students recommended shows, I think so. I think my knowledge about visualities, images, visual cultures is very much connected to Europe and North America, right? And I'm aware of this, but I think this is a constant reminder that, of course, visual cultures, that we have to think about visual cultures in the plural, that they are different. We often say, oh, everyone has seen this picture, right? It's so iconic for our society. That's not true. Yeah, that's not true for other societies, which also means that we don't know what iconic images and imaginaries are out there in other regions. And I understand the hesitation to call this, to now reintroduce an idea of culturally bounded communities, right, who differ. So I think we have both. We have a kind of globalization through pop culture, maybe more than through art, for example. And also I think we have to look maybe the societies and their visual memory and kind of memorizing visually. I think in the German context, the monument this for the murdered Jews in Berlin, this has a long history, right? The discussions around this, how this came about, to create it, the architect who was commissioned, then finally to build it, that we have this weird abstract monument, which is quite unique maybe for it. That of course in other societies and how they think about the past and traumas, you have a different history and way of coping. And the implied question about, is there a lot of research on this? At least I'm not aware of it, which comes to the point that many of these questions are often located at intersections of disciplines, right? This could be about art, history, or cultural theory, cultural studies, right? But also memory studies, which has, I think, grown as a field and reaching out to different, more traditional disciplines like sociology, political science. I think that might be a major challenge why you cannot find so much research now, because it is somehow, it has to develop across typical disciplinary lines.
Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it. And I had one thought about the question that Joschka asked with regards to the football players. And this, I think, goes to obviously something that you said, where these the pictures, the images are always are happening in a contextualized space, right? They're not taken out of, or sometimes they are taken out of context, but there was a debate preceding this image around everything that happened. And then they did this action sort of. But anyway, my question goes in a sort of different direction. I kept thinking about the subjectivity and the situatedness of the photographer. And you touched upon this briefly when you talked about photographers of war, embedded photographers. And I was in Paris a few months ago and was in this exhibition about women photographers of war and how their access to the field, the rooms, basically the spaces, changes, of course, also the images they produce and the photos they produce. And then, of course, we can take this further and ask about other related intersections of subjectivities, right? Like race, gender, sexual orientation, able-bodiedness, and other aspects, and how this changes the images that we see and how we perceive the images of things that we were maybe used to from the single story point of view of a male, white, and cisgendered hetero person. Thanks. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It reminds me of this quote from Bourdieu, that the eye is trained, right? It's not only that the eye is trained, what we are used to see, but also the products that we are seeing, how they are shaped by the societal and historical conditions of their time. And I think maybe there has been a lot of attention, for example, for citizen journalism, for the pluralization of people who are able to provide, in particular, photos, photographs, and stories, somehow reporting like a professional journalist would. And there you can already see that on the one hand, this plurality of voices and of voices and looks is an achievement in itself, right? It gives us a better understanding of things like the perspectives, right? Always thinking about the perspectives in a plural way. But then on the other hand, of course, it also comes with some or produces some problems, right? That the professional ethos and going back to the question of authenticity and how to present something that it's not manipulating the opinion. I think this is also then, of course, part of the story. Yeah? Pluralization on the one hand, but then how much can we trust in the images we see, or are they just personal statements, the pure subjectivity? That was not, maybe we have to talk about this more, but I think it's a good point, right? To ask how the subjectivity of the producer has an impact not only on the product but also on the aesthetics of it.
We have one final question.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thanks, Gabi, also so much from my side. I found your typology really interesting, and I was wondering whether this was rather kind of an ordering function, or whether you also thought about, or whether it's the plan to think about more about the politics, the respective politics of these different typologies, and how the images become politically performative in a different way. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's really straightforward, or maybe my hunch would be right now that maybe it's really contextual, and maybe there cannot be for different kind of politics or political dimensions. But I would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that also, because I think there's so many images that lie at intersections of these different groups, right? I mean, it's an heuristic, obviously, but I thought, for instance, about cultural images that are, or which aim it is to document ongoing violence, such as Ai Weiwei's reenactment of Alan Kurdi, for instance. Yes, I was wondering whether you had thought a bit about that. Yeah. Thanks.
It's a very good point. That's, I think, where I would like to aim with this with this lecture, or talk about, or to think more about the politics that are implied in the different types, categories. And I absolutely think the more I look at the division and selection of images, the less I'm convinced, because some is a bit artificial. You could also add this picture to another category. So I think it's maybe rather a way of thinking about the possibilities, how violence and its representation, how these two things come together, and to show that they can come together in quite different ways. But then, of course, the important question is, what are the effects of these different ways, how violence can be represented or is represented, and so on, right? Yeah, but the political side, I think that's now the next step.
We're looking forward to it. And now we really have quizzed you for 35 minutes straight. You must be very tired. I always find this very exhausting. Yes. So thank you very, very much for giving your time and energy and creativity and inspiration to us. It was really amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next week, what's the talk about? I forgot. Violence in Latin America by Jenny Pierce. It will be very interesting, I think. A very renowned scholar. And hope to see you again. And thanks again, Gabi.
Thank you all for coming.